The courtroom was silent, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. The tension was palpable, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. The case had drawn national attention, a high-profile custody battle between two parents, each fighting for the right to raise their only child, a 6-year-old girl named Emily. The stakes were high and the emotions even higher. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for being unyielding, sat at the bench, her eyes scanning the room as the lawyers prepared their final arguments. And then it happened. The double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a loud bang, startling everyone inside. All eyes turned to the entrance where a scruffy, mud-streaked stray dog stood, panting heavily. Its fur was matted, and its ribs were visible beneath its thin coat. But its eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, seemed to hold a wisdom that no one could quite explain. The dog hesitated for a moment, as if taking in the scene, and then trotted down the center aisle with a purpose that defied its ragged appearance. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The bailiff moved to intercept the animal, but the dog darted past him, weaving through the rows of spectators until it reached the front of the courtroom. It stopped directly in front of the judge's bench, sat down, and let out a soft whine. "What on earth?" Judge Margaret Hayes leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Bailiff, remove that animal at once." But before the bailiff could act, the dog did something that left everyone in the room stunned. It turned its head toward the plaintiff's table, where Emily's father, Daniel, sat with his lawyer. The dog's gaze locked onto Daniel, and it let out a low, mournful howl that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. Daniel's face went pale. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding the dog's piercing stare. I don't know what this is," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It's just a stray. It doesn't mean anything." But the dog wasn't finished. It stood up, walked over to the defense table where Emily's mother, Sarah, sat and gently nuzzled her hand. Sarah, who had been fighting back tears throughout the trial, looked down at the dog in shock. Her hand instinctively reached out to stroke its head, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of peace. "Enough!" she barked. "Bailiff, take that dog outside, and someone explain to me what just happened." As the bailiff approached the dog, it turned and looked directly at the judge, its eyes filled with an almost human-like intensity. Then, without warning, it lay down on the floor, its head resting on its paws, as if it had no intention of leaving. The judge hesitated, her gaze shifting between the dog and the two parents. Something about the animal's presence felt significant. She took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. "We'll take a brief recess," she announced, "and someone find out where that dog came from." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment on camera, while the spectators whispered furiously among themselves. Judge Hayes slammed her gavel down repeatedly, demanding order, but even she couldn't hide her astonishment. The recess gave everyone a chance to catch their breath, but the mystery of the stray dog lingered in the air like a thick fog. Outside the courtroom, Daniel paced nervously, his mind racing. Why had the dog looked at him like that? Why had it howled? He couldn't shake the feeling that the animal knew something he had tried so hard to bury. Inside the judge's chambers, Sarah sat with her lawyer, her hands trembling as she recounted the moment the dog had nuzzled her. It was trying to tell me something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it sounds crazy, but I felt this connection, like it understood what I was going through." Judge Hayes listened intently, her expression unreadable. She had seen a lot in her years on the bench, but nothing like this. She turned to the bailiff, who had been tasked with finding out where the dog had come from. "Any luck?" she asked. The bailiff shook his head. "No collar, no tags. Animal control is on their way, but, well, it's like the dog just appeared out of nowhere." The judge leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being a woman of logic and reason, But there was something about this dog that defied explanation. She couldn't ignore the way it had looked at her, like it was pleading for her to understand. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. The dog was still there, lying quietly in the same spot, as if it had been waiting for them to return. Judge Hayes took her seat and addressed the room. "Before we proceed," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I want to make one thing clear. This court will not be swayed by theatrics. However, given the unusual circumstances, I am allowing the dog to remain for the time being. But let me be clear, this case will be decided on the facts, and the facts alone." The lawyers nodded, though it was clear that neither side knew how to proceed. The dog's presence had thrown a wrench into their carefully laid plans, and the tension in the room was thicker than ever. As the trial resumed, the dog's actions became even more perplexing. Every time Daniel spoke, the dog would let out a soft growl, low and menacing. But when Sarah took the stand, the dog's demeanor changed completely. It wagged its tail and let out a series of short, happy barks, as if it were cheering her on. The jury, already on edge, began to whisper among themselves. What did it mean? Was the dog trying to send a message? Or was it all just a bizarre coincidence? The turning point came during Daniel's cross-examination. His lawyer had been trying to paint him as the more stable, responsible parent, but the dog's constant growling was making it difficult for him to maintain his composure. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Daniel snapped. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Why are you doing this?" The dog responded by standing up and walking over to the evidence table, where a stack of documents had been laid out. It nosed through the papers until it found one in particular, a photograph. With a gentle tug, it pulled the photo free and carried it over to the judge, dropping it at her feet. Judge Hayes picked up the photo and studied it carefully. It was a picture of Daniel, taken several years ago, standing in front of a rundown house with a for sale sign in the yard. But what caught her attention was the figure in the background. A young woman, her face bruised and swollen, staring at the camera with a look of pure despair. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice cold and sharp, "would you care to explain this?" Daniel's face went white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The dog let out another low growl, its eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Sarah, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror, suddenly stood up. "That's her," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the woman he hurt. The one he never wanted anyone to know about." The courtroom erupted into chaos once again, but this time there was no silencing it. The dog's actions had uncovered a secret that Daniel had tried so hard to keep buried, a secret that would change the course of the trial forever. As the trial continued, the focus shifted from the custody battle to the darker, more sinister truth that had been revealed. Daniel's past, once hidden, was now laid bare for all to see. The woman in the photo, it turned out, had been his former girlfriend, a woman he had abused and manipulated for years before she finally found the courage to leave him. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The jury, once sympathetic to Daniel's case, now looked at him with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Even his own lawyer seemed shaken, struggling to find a way to defend his client against the damning evidence. But the dog's actions had also raised a deeper, more profound question. What did it mean to be a good parent? Was it enough to provide for a child materially, or did it require something more? Something that Daniel, with his history of violence and control, clearly lacked. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself grappling with her own emotions. She had always known that Daniel was capable of cruelty, but seeing the evidence laid out so starkly was a painful reminder of the life she had escaped. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. After all, he was still Emily's father. The dog, sensing her turmoil, walked over to her and rested its head on her lap. Sarah looked down at the animal, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Why are you trying to help me?" The dog looked up at her, its eyes filled with a quiet understanding. In that moment, Sarah felt a connection, a bond that went beyond words. It was as if the dog knew her pain, her fear, her hope, and was trying to tell her that everything would be okay. The final day of the trial was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The dog, now a permanent fixture in the courtroom, sat quietly as the lawyers presented their closing arguments. But it was clear that the real decision had already been made, not by the jury, but by the dog itself. When Judge Hayes finally delivered her verdict, the room was silent. She awarded full custody of Emily to Sarah, citing Daniel's history of abuse as the primary factor in her decision. But she also took a moment to address the dog, who had been sitting at Sarah's feet throughout the entire proceeding. "I don't know where you came from," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "But it's clear that you were meant to be here today. You've shown us that sometimes the truth can come from the most unexpected places. And for that we are all grateful." As the courtroom emptied, Sarah knelt down and wrapped her arms around the dog, burying her face in its fur. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving us." The dog let out a soft whine, its tail wagging gently. And then, as if its work was done, it turned and walked out of the courtroom, disappearing into the streets from whence it came. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Emily began to rebuild their lives, free from the shadow of Daniel's abuse. And though they never saw the dog again, they often spoke of it, wondering if it had been an angel in disguise, a guardian sent to protect them when they needed it most. As for Daniel, the trial had changed him in ways he never could have imagined. He sought help for his anger issues, determined to become a better person, not just for Emily but for himself. And though he knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, he vowed to spend the rest of his life trying to make amends. The story of the stray dog spread far and wide, becoming a symbol of hope and redemption for all who heard it. It reminded people that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of light, a chance for change, for forgiveness, for a new beginning. And so, the dog's actions in court that day didn't just change two people's lives, it changed the lives of everyone who witnessed its extraordinary journey. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful forces in the world are the ones we least expect. And that perhaps is the greatest lesson of all.